Everything you know about Anne Boleyn's execution is a lie. History told you she was arrested, tried, and beheaded for adultery. But what if I told you the truth is far more sinister? What if the woman who broke from Rome, who changed the course of English history, who gave birth to the greatest queen England would ever know, was destroyed in just 17 days by a conspiracy so calculated, so methodical, that it makes modern political scandals look like child's play? 17 days. That's all it took to transform the Queen of England from the most powerful woman in the realm into a headless corpse buried in an arrow chest beneath the chapel floor. April 30th, 1536. The Tower of London. A queen walks through the gate not as a visitor, but as a prisoner. Her name is Anne Boleyn, and in exactly 17 days, a French swordsman will separate her head from her body with a single stroke. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Every single charge against her was fabricated. Every witness was coerced. Every piece of evidence was manufactured. This isn't just a story about a queen who lost her head. This is a story about how power destroys anyone who threatens it. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how Anne died, you need to understand how she lived. Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen. She was born to be a pawn. The second daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier desperate to climb the social ladder, and was sent to the courts of Europe as a teenager. First to Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, then to France, where she served Queen Claude. This wasn't education. This was training. Training in how to move through the dangerous waters of royal courts, how to read people, how to survive. And learned well. When she returned to England in 1522, she was transformed. She spoke perfect French, played the lute, danced with continental grace, and dressed in the latest French fashions. But more than that, she had something rare at the English court, intelligence that she wasn't afraid to display. In an era when women were expected to be silent, decorative, and obedient, Anne Boleyn had opinions. Strong ones. King Henry VIII noticed her around 1526. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, but that marriage had failed to produce a male heir. Henry had strayed before. He'd already had an affair with Anne's sister, Mary. Royal mistresses were common, expected even, and should have followed the pattern. Surrender to the king, enjoy the gifts and attention, fade into the background when he lost interest. But Anne Boleyn didn't follow patterns. She broke them when Henry pursued her and refused to become his mistress. She wanted marriage or nothing. This wasn't just ambition. This was survival instinct. She'd watched her sister Mary become the king's plaything and then be discarded with nothing, and understood something fundamental about power. If you're going to risk everything, make sure the prize is worth the risk. Henry became obsessed. For 6 years, he pursued her. 6 years of love letters, gifts, promises. 6 years while he tried to annul his marriage to Catherine. 6 years while he broke from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, just so he could divorce his wife and marry Anne. Think about that. 1,000 years of religious tradition shattered. England's relationship with Rome destroyed. The entire political landscape of Europe transformed. All because one woman said no to being a mistress and demanded to be a queen. They married secretly in January 1533 and was already pregnant. On September 7th, 1533, she gave birth at Greenwich Palace, and the entire kingdom held its breath waiting for the prince that would justify everything Henry had done. But Anne gave birth to a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immediate and crushing. Henry tried to hide it, but everyone knew. Everyone whispered. The Justs were cancelled. The celebrations were muted. And had one job, produce a male heir. And she'd failed. Still, there was time. Anne was young, just in her early 30s. She could have more children. She did get pregnant again in 1534, but that pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The records are unclear, which tells you something about how desperate everyone was to hide the failure. By 1536, Anne had been queen for 3 years. 3 years of constant pressure, constant scrutiny, constant whispers. She hadn't produced a son. She'd made powerful enemies by promoting religious reform. She was outspoken, argumentative, and refused to be the quiet, demure queen that court tradition demanded. And Henry's eye was already wandering to a young lady-in-waiting named Jane Seymour. Quiet, obedient, traditional Jane Seymour. Everything and wasn't. Now here's where it gets dark. Really dark. In January 1536, Anne's nightmare began with Catherine of Aragon's death. You'd think this would be good news for Anne. Her rival was gone. But Catherine's death freed Henry. He could now remarry without the political complications of having two wives alive simultaneously, and had gone from irreplaceable to replaceable in a single day. 2 weeks later, Anne miscarried. But this wasn't just any miscarriage. She was about 15 weeks along, far enough to see that the fetus was male. The son Henry desperately wanted, lost. Some reports claim the fetus was deformed, though these reports might be Protestant propaganda from later decades. What matters is Henry's reaction. He told Anne coldly that he now saw their marriage as cursed by God, just as his marriage to Catherine had been. The same justification he'd used to divorce Catherine, he was now applying to Anne. If this shocked you, hit that like button. Because what comes next is even more calculated. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw an opportunity. Cromwell was brilliant, ruthless, and completely pragmatic. He'd helped Henry break from Rome. He'd helped orchestrate Anne's rise. But now Anne was attacking Cromwell's policies, particularly his plan to dissolve the monasteries and seize their wealth, and wanted that money used for education and charity. Cromwell wanted it for the crown's treasury. They were on a collision course, and only one of them was going to survive. Cromwell began collecting evidence, or rather, manufacturing it. April 1536. A court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house. Not the Tower, Cromwell's personal residence. There, over the course of hours, possibly tortured though no one knows for certain, Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen. One confession, from a man of low birth who had everything to lose. But it was enough. On May 1st, a joust was held at Greenwich. Anne was there with Henry. A message was delivered to the king. He stood abruptly, took 6 men with him, and rode straight to Westminster. He left Anne behind, confused and afraid. She never saw him again. The next day, April 30th, let me correct that. May 2nd, 1536. Anne was arrested at Greenwich and taken by barge to the Tower of London. She entered through the same water gate she'd processed through triumphantly for her coronation just 3 years earlier. Now she entered as a prisoner, accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. Her brother, George Boleyn. The charges claimed and had committed incest with him. 4 other men were arrested. Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his closest friends. William Brereton, a groom of the Privy Chamber. Francis Weston, another royal favorite. And Mark Smeaton, the musician who'd already confessed. What do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments, because the evidence against Anne is so flimsy, so contradictory, that historians have spent nearly 500 years trying to understand how this travesty of justice occurred. Here's what we know. The dates given for the alleged affairs were impossibly specific. April 12, 1533, at Greenwich. And supposedly committed adultery at Greenwich that day. But royal records prove she wasn't at Greenwich on April 12, 1533. She was at Windsor. Multiple dates in the indictment can be disproven this way. The prosecution didn't even bother to verify that and was in the same location as her supposed lovers. More damning, one of the dates given was April 26, 1533. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was born September 7, 1533. Count backwards 9 months from Elizabeth's birth. The alleged adultery happened after Elizabeth was already conceived. So even if Anne had committed adultery on that date, it was irrelevant to Elizabeth's legitimacy, which was supposedly one of Henry's concerns. The case was absurd, but it didn't matter, because this was never about evidence. This was about removing an obstacle, and was interrogated in the Tower. She was frantic, talking rapidly, defending herself desperately. She was kept in the same room she'd stayed in before her coronation, a deliberate psychological torture. The constable of the Tower reported that Anne alternated between wild protestations of innocence and hysterical laughter. She asked constantly if her alleged lovers had confessed. She worried especially about Norris and Weston, who she knew were innocent. Meanwhile, Cromwell worked methodically. He interviewed dozens of witnesses. He collected testimony about Anne's behavior, her conversations, her relationships with men at court. He twisted innocent interactions into evidence of infidelity. A conversation became a seduction. A gift became proof of an affair. Anne's spirited personality, which had attracted Henry in the first place, was now reframed as evidence of her loose morals. The trials began on May 12th. First, the four commoners, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton. They were tried together at Westminster Hall before a special jury. Only Smeaton maintained his confession. The others insisted on their innocence. All four were convicted and sentenced to death. 3 days later, May 15th, and her brother George were tried separately in the Great Hall of the Tower, and faced a jury of 27 peers, presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk, who despised her. Norfolk, who saw her as an upstart who'd brought shame to the family by her fall from grace. Think about that. Your uncle, judging you in a trial where the verdict is already decided. The evidence against Anne was pathetic. Much of it consisted of testimony about her conversations with men, her flirtations, her sharp tongue. She'd once given Henry Norris a handkerchief. She'd told Francis Weston he loved her more than he loved his wife. These were the behaviors of a Renaissance court, where courtly love traditions made such interactions normal. Reframed through Cromwell's lens, they became proof of adultery, and defended herself brilliantly. She was composed, articulate, and devastatingly logical in dismantling the prosecution's case. Observers noted that she made such a good defense that several jury members seemed convinced of her innocence. It didn't matter. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. George Boleyn's trial was even more grotesque. The charge of incest was based largely on testimony from his own wife, Lady Rochford, who claimed George had spent suspicious amounts of time alone with Anne. At trial, a note was passed to George containing a question. Had Anne ever said that Henry was impotent? George was supposed to just confirm yes or no. Instead, he read the question aloud in court, publicly humiliating the king. It was a final act of defiance, and it sealed his fate. Both were sentenced to death. For Anne, the sentence was burning at the stake or beheading at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a final act of mercy, chose beheading. More than that, he sent to France for an expert swordsman rather than using the traditional axe and block, and would kneel upright, and the sword would take her head cleanly. It was considered a more honorable and less painful death. Small comfort when you're about to be murdered by the state for crimes you didn't commit. If you're shocked by how fast this happened, how calculated this destruction was, smash that subscribe button. Because we're about to enter the final days, and what happened next reveals something profound about Anne Boleyn's character. May 17th, Anne's 5 alleged lovers were executed on Tower Hill. Smeaton died, still confessing his guilt. The others died, proclaiming their innocence. George Boleyn gave a speech acknowledging he was a sinner, as was customary, but he never confessed to incest, and was in the Tower as they died. She would have heard the crowds roar. She had 2 days left to live. On May 18th, Archbishop Cranmer arrived at the Tower. He'd been Anne's ally, one of the men she'd promoted. Now he came to annul her marriage to Henry, and agreed. Why? Perhaps she hoped it would save her life. Perhaps she hoped it would protect Elizabeth. Perhaps she was simply broken by this point. The marriage was declared null and void, and had been queen. Now she was nothing. Her daughter Elizabeth was declared a bastard. The execution was scheduled for May 19th at 9 in the morning, and prepared carefully. She heard Mass, received communion, and swore repeatedly on the sacrament that she was innocent. This was significant. In Tudor England, lying while receiving communion was considered a mortal sin that would damn your soul to hell, and swore her innocence knowing she was about to meet her maker. She wore a gray damask gown with a red underdress, a crimson petticoat. Red was the color of martyrdom. Her hair was pinned up, her neck exposed. She gave her prayer book to one of her attendants, with a message inscribed inside for her daughter. But here's what's haunting. The execution was delayed. First until noon. Then it was postponed entirely until the next day. The swordsman from France hadn't arrived, and spent an additional day waiting to die, her nerves stretched to breaking point. Was it incompetence? Or was it deliberate cruelty? We'll never know. May 19th, 1536. Dawn. And dressed again in her execution clothes. She'd barely slept. She was led out to the scaffold erected on Tower Green, a private execution ground within the tower itself. Normally, executions were public spectacles on Tower Hill. But Anne was still technically queen, and Henry wanted to minimize the spectacle. About 1,000 people were present. Lords, officials, witnesses, and climbed the scaffold steps steadily. She wore a cape over her gray gown. Beneath it, her red petticoat would hide the blood. And here's where Anne Boleyn showed who she really was. She didn't rage. She didn't protest her innocence one final time, though she could have. Instead, she gave a speech carefully crafted to protect her daughter and her family. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord. She said the law had judged her to death, and she wouldn't question it. She asked people to pray for the king, for he is a good man and has treated me as well as could be. Every word a lie, every word necessary, because Anne knew that anything she said against Henry would be taken out on Elizabeth. Her daughter was 3 years old, now declared illegitimate, vulnerable, and alone. Anne's final act as a mother was to swallow her rage, her fear, her truth, and praise the man who was murdering her. She removed her cape and her headdress. Her ladies tied a blindfold over her eyes. She knelt upright, her hands clasped in prayer. She kept repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman approached silently from behind. He'd removed his shoes so she wouldn't hear him coming, and never knew the exact moment. He called out to his assistant, "Bring me the sword." A distraction to make and turn her head. As she turned, he swung. One stroke. Clean. Fast. And Boleyn's head fell forward, separated from her body. Her lips were still moving in prayer. They say Henry was playing tennis at Westminster when she died. When he received word of the execution, he changed clothes and went to visit Jane Seymour. 10 days later, he married her. Anne's body and head were placed in an arrow chest, no coffin having been prepared for her. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower, in an unmarked grave. No funeral, no ceremony, no marker. The queen who changed England was buried like a common criminal in a borrowed box. But here's the thing about Anne Boleyn. Here's why we're still talking about her nearly 500 years later. She lost everything. Her crown, her reputation, her life. Her daughter was declared a bastard. Her family was disgraced. Her name became synonymous with adultery and treason. Everything she'd fought for, destroyed in 17 days. Yet she still won. Because that little girl, Elizabeth, that 3-year-old bastard declared illegitimate by her father, she became Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. She ruled for 45 years. She never married, never let a man control her, never forgot what happened to her mother. Under Elizabeth, England became a world power. The Church of England that Anne had supported became permanently established. The religious reforms Anne had championed took root. Anne's blood didn't just flow on Tower Green that May morning. It flowed through the veins of the woman who would define an age. And Thomas Cromwell? He fell just 4 years later, in 1540. Henry had him executed for treason, a victim of the same judicial murder he'd perfected against Anne. Cromwell went to the block on Tower Hill, and the executioner was incompetent. It took 3 strokes to sever his head. He suffered the messy, agonizing death that Anne had been spared. Henry VIII ended his life bloated, diseased, and paranoid. He married 6 times, executing 2 of his wives. When he died in 1547, he weighed close to 400 pounds, his legs oozing with infection, his mind deteriorating. He was buried next to Jane Seymour, the only wife who'd given him a legitimate son. That son, Edward VI, died at 15. Henry's great dynasty, the reason he'd torn apart his kingdom and destroyed so many lives, ended with his last child, Anne Boleyn's daughter. History has a sense of irony. Modern historians have thoroughly exonerated Anne. Every serious scholar acknowledges that the charges against her were fabricated. Her adultery trial is taught in law schools as an example of judicial murder. In 2006, for 170 years after her death, her innocence was officially recognized by the British establishment. Not that it matters to Anne. She's been dust for centuries. But here's my question for you. What do you think Anne felt in those final seconds? When the blindfold covered her eyes and she knelt on Tower Green, her hands clasped in prayer, her neck exposed to the sword. Did she think of Elizabeth? Did she think of Henry, the man she'd loved and who destroyed her? Did she feel rage or acceptance or terror? And here's the bigger question. Could you do what she did? Could you face your own execution with that much grace, that much control, knowing you were innocent but unable to say it? Could you praise your murderer with your last breath to protect someone you loved? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, if you see Anne Boleyn differently now, hit that like button and subscribe. Because history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about people. Complicated, flawed, courageous people who faced impossible choices and somehow found the strength to keep going until they couldn't anymore. And Boleyn was destroyed in 17 days. But her legacy has lasted 500 years. And that, more than anything, is her revenge.